London in 1888 was gripped by fear. A bloodthirsty maniac stalked the East End streets, killing and mutilating women. Historian and author Mai Tro has spent 20 years investigating Whitechapel, this murderous square mile. In an autumn of terror, 5 women were killed here in just 10 weeks. The murderer, who was never caught, the press dubbed Jack the Ripper. Now, using 21st century police forensic techniques, Mai believes he can finally crack the greatest unsolved case in criminal history. Using psychological and geographical offender profiling and delving into the world of the Victorian mortuary, he will track Jack down. We look into his mind.
It's just this deriving pleasure from inflicting psychological pain.
Interpret his crimes.
He's getting more curious to know what's under the surface.
We track his moves and even name 2 extra victims.
Jack is really very similar to any other form of predatory animal looking to a place to find its prey.
Finally, we name the new prime suspect, someone never suspected or investigated before. More than a century after he stalked the London streets, the hunt for Jack the Ripper has begun again. The inhabitants of Victorian London's Whitechapel were desperately poor, crammed up to 80 a room and left to rot. It was an area riddled with violent crime, drunkenness and prostitution. There were over 60 brothels here, and a further 1,200 women walked the streets. A perfect place for Jack the Ripper to find and kill his victims.
We're standing on the western edge of Jack's killing ground. The first murder took place over there. It can only be 10 minutes away. That is the furthest eastern extent of his killing zone.
She was my wife, Polly Nichols.
Murder number 2 took place 2 streets in that direction.
She was my sister Annie, the widow of John Chapman.
Murder number 3, down that way, maybe 5 minutes from where we're standing.
We lived together as man and wife. Her name was Liz Stride.
Number 4, slightly to the west.
Her name was Catherine Eddowes.
And number 5, well, number 5 took place exactly where we're standing now, directly below us.
The face is gashed beyond all recognition.
Who could perpetrate such acts? The Victorians thought this bloodthirsty killer must surely be a monster. A harmless mental patient by the name of Aaron Kosminski became a suspect because he ate from the gutter and claimed to hear voices. Police suspicion also fell on John Pizer, known as Leather Apron. The press fanned the flames and he was arrested, but had a cast-iron alibi for the night of the first murder.
Someone killed a certain number of women in Whitechapel in 1888. And here we are 120 years later and we still don't know who that person is.
Later came ever more fanciful speculation. Was the killer perhaps Prince Albert Edward, Queen Victoria's grandson and heir to the throne? Was it Victoria's physician, William Gull, engaged in a Masonic plot? Hunt the Ripper has become a game. Dozens of solutions have been offered.
Anybody really who was alive in 1888 might well fit in the frame. And it's rattling good stuff. It's excellent fiction. It's wonderful for conspiracy theorists, but it doesn't actually add up. It doesn't make sense. If you ask anybody in the street, what do you think Jack the Ripper looked like? They will tell you that he wore a cape, he had a top hat, he carried his knife in this fashion, and he struck down like so. We must strip away all that. We must get away from the caped figure in the fog. We must get to the reality. And the reality is simply that Jack was an ordinary man.
After 4 fruitless years, the police closed their inquiry. But now, 120 years later, historian and author My Tro is opening a new investigation. There is a new Ripper story with more attacks and a new prime suspect.
Most people believe there were 5 victims of Jack, but I think there were 2 more. One before the first of the 5, and it happened just over there. I also think there was one after number 5, and that happened just there. Both well within Jack's killing ground. It all happens in the same small space.
To piece together his theory, I will re-examine key details from each of the murders. It's widely accepted that Polly Nichols was the first victim of Jack the Ripper, the first of a pattern. She was 43 years old and her children grown up. An alcoholic, she was separated from her husband.
She got drunk every time I took her back. That's why I had to leave her altogether.
She had no permanent home. To pay for lodging, she prostituted herself on the streets. She'd had her DOS money 3 times that day, she said, and drank it. She needed one more trick to rent a bed to sleep in. Bucks Row lies on the northwest edge of Whitechapel. Here, after 3 a.m. on the morning of the 31st of August 1888, Polly Nichols was walking with her last client.
Jack the Ripper's first victim died here in Bucks Row. Her name was Polly Nichols. He was trying to get her inside the double doors of Brown's stable yard, but that didn't work because they were locked, so he killed her here at my feet.
The old schoolhouse towered over the scene in 1888, but the street itself was just a row of small terraced houses. Only minutes after Jack killed Polly Nichols, her body was found by 2 market porters on their way to work. They saw what at first they thought to be a tarpaulin, or a pile of rags.
When they looked closer, of course, they could see it was a woman, they could see that her skirts had been pulled up, and they could see that her throat had been cut. I think very humanely, very sweetly, one of them lowered Polly Nichols' skirts to give her some kind of dignity, which is a nice touch.
Because of the porter's delicacy, the extent and nature of her injuries was only discovered when Polly's body was taken to the mortuary. Her wounds went far beyond what was necessary to cause death. There were large gashes to the abdomen, and her sexual organs had been cut. Polly wasn't raped, but the nature and the intensity of the attack revealed the disturbed state of the killer's mind.
Bodies for us are sacrosanct, aren't they? Mutilation of it is, to the overwhelming majority of us, just abhorrent. But that would be sexually pleasurable to someone like Jack the Ripper. Deriving pleasure from that intimate contact with that body by ripping it apart.
What a serial killer does, where he goes and when, can be clues to his likely thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Myers' theory of a new suspect was sparked off by a psychological profile of Jack the Ripper made by the FBI in 1988, 100 years after the murders. The profile listed Jack's likely age, behavior patterns, and where he might live. But most striking for May was the mention in the report of the killer's likely occupation. A mortician's assistant, perhaps, or a morgue attendant.
Somewhere at the back of my mind, I had this idea that there is a mortuary attendant in the Ripper story, in the historical record. Somebody who actually has a name, who is flesh and blood.
In the press reports of the inquest into the death of the Ripper's first victim, May finds not only the testimony of a mortuary attendant, but also his name.
His name was Robert Mann, and he appeared at the inquest of Polly Nichols. And the more I looked into this character, the more I realized that he might have a great deal to do with those murders in Whitechapel. Is there rather more to Robert Mann than meets the eye?
Historian Mai Tro is investigating a new prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper murders.
Somewhere at the back of my mind, I had this idea that there is a mortuary attendant in the Ripper story. His name was Robert Mann, and he appeared at the inquest of Polly Nichols.
Mai wants to step into Mann's world. At St. George's in the East Church on the edge of Whitechapel stands a ruined Victorian mortuary.
Robert Mann's mortuary in Regal Place is gone, it's been demolished. But I wanted to see what kind of place he would have worked in. I wanted to see a mortuary in which he would have carried out his grisly task.
Public mortuaries were always well ventilated to banish disease-bearing vapours. The period between death and burial could be a week, so their main function was storage, to avoid families or workhouse inmates having to share a room with a decomposing corpse. This is just the kind of place where Robert Mann worked.
It would have been cold, it would have been dank, he'd been alone in there with bodies for hours on end.
In a case of suspicious death, a post-mortem examination was carried out. The body was cut open and the organs inspected by a physician. A doctor or mortuary attendant could be called by a coroner to give evidence at an inquest in order to establish the cause of death. Robert Mann was called at Polly Nichols' inquest. His testimony was reported in the Times newspaper.
Robert Mann, a pauper inmate of the Whitechapel workhouse, stated he had charge of the mortuary.
He unlocked the mortuary for the police that morning. But what happened after they left him with the body is revealing.
After breakfast, the witness and another inmate of the workhouse undressed the body. No police or anyone else was present.
Crucially, Mann's treatment of the body contravened the strict orders of Police Inspector Helson.
He distinctly told the mortuary keeper not to touch the body.
If you've got an individual that has a sexual interest in corpses and they work in the mortuary, then clearly they're going to find it extremely difficult to resist touching, thinking about, trying to find ways to do something with that body.
The coroner in 1888 characterized Robert Mann as an inadequate witness. He was considered insignificant, beneath official and police attention. But it was this very insignificance which served Mann so well.
You've only got to look at recent history to see notorious cases, serial notorious cases, where people have been missed.
Almost 100 years after Jack, his namesake, the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, killed 13 women in the UK. He was interviewed by police 9 times over 5 years and released. He was finally stopped for a minor motoring offense. In the US, cannibal serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer murdered and dismembered 15 men in the 5 years the police took to find him. He was only discovered when a victim escaped and led police to his apartment. The coroner may have been addressing Jack the Ripper himself and not known it. Robert Mann is listed as the mortuary attendant, age 46, in the Whitechapel Infirmary Workhouse records of 1881. So at the time of the murders, he was in his early 50s. It seems he lived in the same area his whole life.
You do get sometimes.
Psychologist and profiler Professor Lawrence Allison has worked with senior police detectives investigating high-profile serial murders.
It's very uncommon to get offenders, particularly sexually violent offenders, that are prepared to travel any particular distance. So any proposed suspect that lives outside of the area of Whitechapel is relatively low on the suspect list.
Robert Mann grew up in the Whitechapel workhouse. His father died when he was only 7. Both these factors shaped him. But it's his job there in the mortuary that is key.
One of the key indicators are individuals that are attracted to environments that bring them close either to authority or death. So obviously the mortuary would be a very key indicator of that.
Absolutely.
Maya's beginning to find intriguing facts to focus suspicion in the Ripper murders onto Robert Mann. He had an absent father and a tough, deprived childhood. He was a local man through and through, and worked in the mortuary where he witnessed the dissection of bodies.
The fact that you have a local man and you have a plausible, psychologically coherent explanation for this post-mortem mutilation and increasing interest in that, I think it certainly is in favour of Mann, above and beyond many of these other preposterous individuals where I think the motivation and the psychological configuration is absent or ignored.
If I asked you the impossible to rate, from what you know so far, which is almost nothing about this man, rate him a number out of 10, what would you give him?
On a psychological scale, from what little I know of the plausibility of this person, I'd probably put him around an 8.
An 8.
It seems Robert Mann has put himself at the centre of events in the aftermath of the Whitechapel murders. Now, Maya wants to analyse the modus operandi of Jack, his foolproof killing method that prepares the way for the shocking mutilations. After the murder of Polly Nichols, it took just 8 days for dark thoughts to overwhelm the Ripper once again.
So you'd get this gradual build-up across that 8-day period where there's a strong and overwhelming desire to repeat this. Fantasy becomes much more enticing and real, in a way, than reality. There may have been things that Jack was thinking, well, actually, if I'd had more time, I could have done more mutilation, and so on.
The Ripper's second victim was Annie Chapman. All the victims came from ordinary working-class backgrounds and had fallen on hard times. In Annie Chapman's case, personal tragedy had laid her low.
Her husband died 18 months ago now. After that, she rather gave up.
She sank into petty theft, prostitution and drink.
She'd certainly had enough that night.
Hanbury Street was at the eastern edge of the red light district in Whitechapel. At first light, after 5:30 a.m. on the 8th of September, Annie Chapman was seen against some shutters talking with a man.
Number 29 Hanbury Street stood here, and as you see, it's completely gone. In fact, it would have been very like number 30 across the road. There you've got 2 doors side by side. The one on the right leads into the shop at the front of the street. The one on the left leads through to a yard that goes right to the back of the property. That's where prostitutes took their clients.
At around 6 a.m. on the morning of the 8th of September, John Davis, a wagon driver, came down the stairs of number 29 Hanbury Street. He was leaving for work. He saw that the back door was slightly ajar and went to investigate.
The head was about 6 inches in front of the bottom step. The left arm lay across the left breast. The legs were drawn up. The feet were on the ground and the knees turned outward.
Even while he was killing, the Ripper was thinking about the impact the body would have on police and public. The cut on Annie Chapman's neck was so deep that it almost severed her head.
The intestines were partially removed and positioned over her left shoulder.
It generated shock and fear. He would have seen it in his neighbours' faces as he walked the streets, and that was part of the thrill.
There's the cruelty of killing someone. There's the cruelty of the infliction of gross acts of mutilation on the body. And there's the added cruelty of knowing that you are going to be disturbing the police that have turned up at the crime scene and the general public that are going to be reading this material. And there's just this constant process of deriving pleasure from inflicting psychological pain.
To find out more about the Ripper's methods, Mai turns to Dr. Peter Dean. He's a coroner and a police surgeon for Whitechapel. If the Ripper struck today, it would be on Peter Dean's patch. Peter has studied the post-mortem reports of both Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman.
It's likely in both of these cases, from the descriptions of the protrusion of the tongue and the facial bruises, that he may well, in both cases, have rapidly asphyxiated the victims first. So he's getting that initial control, then moving on to killing them quickly, and then that's enabling him to, in a sense, move on to the next phase of what he's doing, which is the post-mortem mutilation.
Jack didn't kill by cutting. He killed in order to cut. He killed in order to do those things which excited and satisfied him. Could the doctor who examined Annie Chapman's body at the time link the knife to Robert Mann's mortuary?
George Baxter Phillips thought it was possible that a post-mortem knife could have been used to inflict these injuries. Do you think he was right?
He's right in that it's a possibility. Clearly, he's got to have something sharp enough and long enough to create this sort of range of injuries. Now, clearly, a post-mortem knife is a possibility.
Only key professionals would know how to wield such a knife with knowledge and skill. Dr. Baxter Phillips also found that the mode in which the knife had been used seemed to indicate great anatomical knowledge.
Obviously, from my point of view, with Robert Mann, the mortuary assistant, I'm looking at someone who would surely have been standing by a doctor's elbow while he was carrying out this kind of thing.
I mean, it's an interesting theory. I mean, clearly, as a mortuary assistant, he would have had experience of seeing pathologists or seeing doctors conduct post-mortem examinations in those circumstances, so it's entirely possible that he may have had some experience in that area.
Mai goes hunting for the exact location of Robert Mann's mortuary, helped by East End historian John Bennett. Could this area be the serial killer's base? And did he start killing nearby? Together, they study maps, placing new over old. And by looking at an 1888 sketch of the mortuary, realize they might be able to find the actual site. Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman were both taken to Robert Mann's mortuary in Eagle Place, Old Montague Street.
Now, I have never found a map with Eagle Place on it. This is my problem.
Have you seen one of these before?
No, what is that?
That is a Goad fire insurance map, much more detailed than your average ordnance survey map. If you look on your magnifying glass, you scan along all these little courts along there.
Yeah, there it is. Eagle Place, there it is.
Eagle Place.
Brilliant. At the end of it then, could that be our mortuary?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Yes. If you look at the Goad
In the corner of Eagle Place on the map are two buildings at right angles. The drawing shows the same, but there's a problem. The old streets were demolished in the 70s and 80s. Eagle Place has been wiped from the face of Whitechapel. But John has found a method to reveal on the modern street plan exactly where it used to be.
So you have your new map, for example, and your old map, and this one's an 1894 map, and there is our mortuary. So if we put the new over the top of the old one, but we've got obviously got to make sure they line up, and you can see we just colour in our mortuary.
Wow.
And if we take the old one off, there you have where the mortuary was, and it's crossing over somebody's garden.
Yeah, I'd never have found that. Never in a month of Sundays.
Matching up maps is much easier than finding a real location on the ground. But Mai is determined to work out where the old mortuary stood.
On the map, if I remember rightly, it shows it going across two gardens into a third.
Well, the site of the mortuary, when we marked it off, crossed two gardens.
Right.
And then there was a gap.
So that gap is the mortuary?
That's where the mortuary was.
The passageway we've just walked through is Robert Mann's mortuary.
It's only 3 minutes' walk to the first murder of Polly Nichols in Bucks Row, and barely 5 minutes to the second, Annie Chapman in Hanbury Street. The mortuary is a prime site for the Ripper's lair. In 1888, the newspaper sketch artist drew the mortuary with a policeman standing outside. This helps John and Mai to pinpoint its location.
There was a policeman standing right here, which would have put the wall, the eastern wall of the mortuary, round about here, somewhere.
And then the back wall, if I can call it that, would be somewhere here.
Out there, yeah.
And that's it. That's the extent of Robert Mann's mortuary. From there to there, this is where it all happened. The first victim, Polly Nichols, brought here. The second victim, Annie Chapman, brought here. Robert Mann works here. The story of Jack the Ripper starts right on this spot.
Mai's investigation is uncovering a new Jack and finding new facts to haunt us.
The most chilling prospect is that Robert Mann is selecting the people he does, in the places he does, because he knows that they will come back to his mortuary.
In September 1888, London had seen 2 women murdered and mutilated in just over a week. The Victorians thought they had a monster in their midst, but historian Mai Trove is investigating a suspect never named before, the Whitechapel mortuary attendant, Robert Mann. Serial killer psychology means he is likely to have attacked women before.
Jack the Ripper definitely would have had some precursive trail from the difficulties in childhood, exposure to violence, and gradual transition from that victimization as a child to that first murder.
Polly Nichols can't possibly be Jack the Ripper's first victim. There has to be some kind of earlier example of a crime of a similar nature. Perhaps not a full-blown murder, perhaps an attack.
This is the Flower and Dean estate in Whitechapel. In 1888, it was a warren of courts and alleyways. In the year before the murders, each of Jack's victims lived in the doss houses here, and this is where Mai believes Robert Mann found an early victim. In George Yard Buildings.
This archway is all that's left of George Yard Buildings, but I think this is where the story of Jack the Ripper really starts. It's within the heart of his killing zone, and the murder that took place behind me bears his signature. This is where Jack's reign of terror really began.
Martha Tabram, like Jack's other victims, was middle-aged. Heavy drinking had broken her marriage, and she supported herself with prostitution. 3 weeks before the attack on Polly Nichols, Martha and a friend were entertaining clients, 2 guardsmen. Late that night, Martha's friend paired with one soldier, and Martha took the other into George Yard. The next morning, Martha's body was found on a landing in George Yard Buildings. Her throat was not cut. The doctor at post-mortem said the fatal wound through her chest appeared to have been inflicted by a dagger or a bayonet.
I believe that Robert Mann is out on the town that night as well, and he turns down George Yard Buildings and he comes across the body of Martha Tabram. He can see that she's dead, but this is his opportunity. He's carrying in his pocket a clasp knife, and he takes it out. He rips up Martha's skirt and he goes to work. He stabs and cuts in a frenzied manner 38 times. This is a horrific sex attack. And what we're seeing in that attack is the first tentative steps in the signature of a serial killer.
In sexually sadistic murder, it's not uncommon for offenders to have some erectile dysfunctional problem. It is that kind of use of a weapon as the penetrative act.
Martha's wounds were to her breasts, belly and groin, a similar focus to those of Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. And chillingly, just as they were, Martha was delivered to Robert Mann's Whitechapel mortuary. When after 5 years and 13 murders, the Yorkshire Ripper was finally caught, his address was exactly where a groundbreaking geographical analysis had predicted it would be. This kind of profiling is now used worldwide to narrow down a field of suspects.
Geographic profiling is an investigative technique that's used to help identify the most probable location where an offender lives or where they anchor their activities. It could be their place of work, or it could be another location from which they are going out and committing offences.
Geographic profiler Spencer Cheney has analysed the location of Jack the Ripper's murder sites of 1888 and produced the kind of profile he might present to an investigating police detective today. The profile shows not just one hotspot where Jack is most likely to operate, but two. On the left, to the west, is the old red light district.
I think that this area here is identifying Jack the Ripper's hunting zone.
Right.
This is where he's coming to find his women.
Sure.
But I find this area up here interesting.
The hotspot on the right, to the east, is a smaller patch very near the two early murders of Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman.
It's telling me that Jack knew something about this location as well.
Yeah, for me, this is absolutely brilliant because this area here is where Robert Mann's mortuary was.
Okay.
That, as far as I'm concerned, is his lair. That's his centre of operation.
Again, it's interesting that this profile is highlighting this neighbourhood as well.
Typically, serial murderers start by killing close to home. So the eastern hotspot on the geographic profile makes Robert Mann an even more likely. Catherine Eddowes worked as a prostitute, and on the night of the 30th of September was arrested for being drunk and incapable. It was only 8 p.m. Elizabeth Stride was also a prostitute, and like Catherine, she had been drinking that night. At 11 p.m., she was seen in the doorway of a pub with an unidentified man. Police released a more sober Catherine Eddowes at 1 a.m., and she set out towards Aldgate. That night, they both fell foul of the psychological ebb and flow of a serial killer's mind. The Ripper's local knowledge of the red light district to the west was confirmed on a horrific night of double murder.
In the autumn of 1888, there were rows of shops and houses along here. All gone now, of course. But here, at this point where I'm standing, this was the entrance to Dutfield's yard.
It was here inside the yard that Jack cut Liz Stride's throat. But then, even before he had time to make his trademark second cut, he was interrupted by a merchant returning home from a long day's work.
Louis Diemschutz and his pony and trap came in this way as well. Jack heard that sound. He had to stop.
When Liz Stride's body was discovered at 1 a.m., it was still warm. The fatal cut to her throat was still bleeding. Beyond this single wound, she had no other injuries.
After the first murder, there wasn't mutilation, and the only thing that really is going to count and that is going to be satisfying is that second offence and the capacity to then mutilate that second victim. To hang the consequences, I've got to do this, and I've got to do it now.
Just 45 minutes later, to the west, in the city of London itself, Jack attacks another woman. And now he has time to do what he wants with the body.
In 1888, Mitre Square was enclosed by buildings as high as this. Warehouses on that side, behind me, and here. Where I'm standing is the darkest part of the square, and this is where Jack killed Kate Eddowes. the most ghastly mutilations to date.
When you look at the actual pattern of injuries here, there's a very significant difference to the previous ones in terms of extent. You've got this massive abdominal wound, the movement of the intestines, the removal of the uterus and one of the kidneys.
The Ripper's fantasies seem to be growing, leading him to more extreme behavior.
And we can then adjust.
Significantly, geographic profiling reveals how he operated in his hunting zone, showing us the route he may have walked from one murder scene to the next.
He wants to escape, calm himself down and get back to his own comfort zone, which I think is north. So he would have headed up Bernard Street.
What, he'd be turning left out of Duckville's yard?
Yep.
Up Bernard Street?
Yes.
So how does he end up over here in Mitre Square?
Well, I think that once he's possibly calmed himself down, I reckon he's then coming back into what I would class as his hunting territory.
Mai has always assumed that after failing to mutilate Liz Stride, Jack was forced to break his routine and strike out randomly into unknown territory. But serial killers stick with a proven method.
It's possible that he comes across Catherine Eddowes in this area here, and it's Catherine who takes him to there.
She takes him to Mitre Square as somewhere that is quiet and secluded. They won't be interrupted. Yes, I see.
Jack infamously vanished after the attacks like a phantom. Someone like Robert Mann, a local and familiar face, could hide in plain sight. Just blend in.
For me, this is absolutely fascinating because the mortuary attendant, Robert Mann, was born just here.
Well, just in this area in here, yeah?
In Hope Street. It's just there. It's very much within that central area that you have profiled as being his killing zone.
The geographic profiling corroborates Mai's theory that Jack the Ripper is a local man through and through. Both where he grew up and where he lives are where the murders take place. Robert Mann is looking more and more like a prime suspect. 1 week after the murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, a letter arrived for Mr. George Lusk. He was chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local men who patrolled the streets trying to catch the Ripper red-handed. But Jack would have the last laugh. The newspapers and police received hundreds of hoax messages claiming to be from the killer. But this was different. This letter was headed from hell. It came with half a kidney.
From hell, Mr. Lusk, sir. I sent you half a kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice.
There's something about the level of illiteracy which comes across as quite authentic. The preserved reference, the nice spelt with an S, the kidney without the Y, etc.
I might send you the bloody knife that took it out, if only you wait a while longer.
When people fake letters, there's a kind of self-evident faking of illiteracy or another identity. There's something about this that rings a little bit true.
Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
So of all of them, that is the one that to me is quite chilling. And the fact that at the top of it says from hell, to me speaks somewhat of someone that is in a disturbed state, but also wants to have some impact here. There's vicarious pleasure to be had in that letter turning up in the media. That's another way of extracting pleasure from the process.
The kidney was declared human by Dr. Openshaw of the London Hospital. The press reported it had been preserved in spirits of wine, pure alcohol.
Who could preserve it? Who could keep a kidney in a certain condition? A mortuary attendant could do that. Why? Because a mortuary attendant would have rows and rows of jars full of spirits of wine for just such a job.
Dr. Openshaw also noted there was 1 inch of renal artery still attached, and his colleagues said that the kidney showed signs of Bright's disease.
That kidney was said to suffer from Bright's disease, a disease of the kidneys from which Catherine Eddowes was also said to suffer, and it was stated at the time that the length of renal artery on the kidney was consistent with the amount remaining in the body. Now, if those reports are accurate, then that attaches a considerable degree of significance to the Lusk letter and that half kidney.
Jack the Ripper's first 4 canonical murders had taken place in just 1 month. The extensive injuries were shocking, but worse was to come. Far from the murderer running out of steam, the attacks were escalating. For Jack the Ripper in his sights. He's closing in on the Whitechapel mortuary attendant, Robert Mann. Mann's mortuary was within minutes of the first 2 murders. He possessed the right knife skills through his work there, and geographical profiling has put his birthplace in the red light district.
This is the primary hunting zone here that's been identified from this profile. What is fascinating is that this location here, this is where Mary Kelly, on the evening of the murder, where she was seen picking up a man there.
Right. She picks up a man here and takes him back
Mary Kelly takes her men back to her...
Miller's Court, yeah, absolutely.
Jack's next assault on the northeastern edge of Whitechapel's murderous square mile was even more horrific than the last. He was led here by a growing need for more time with his victims. At Annie Chapman's inquest, Dr. Baxter Phillips testified that even he would need 15 minutes to inflict such injuries. The extreme mutilations on Catherine Eddowes also fitted into a 15-minute gap in police patrols. On the street, this was all the time the Ripper was ever going to get.
So what he wants to do now is to find somewhere else to carry out those mutilations, fully, properly, almost at his leisure.
Mary Kelly, Jack's next victim, was different from the others. She was much younger, around 25. She was said to be pretty. But what attracted Jack was that she rented her own room. The Whites Row car park overlooks the exact spot where Mary Kelly took Jack the Ripper that night. Mary Kelly's room gave Jack all the time in the world. An eyewitness saw Mary go in with a man at 2:30 that night. Nothing more was seen, but another witness heard Mary Kelly's door close at 5:45 in the morning.
Now that gives us 3¼ hours for Jack to carry out the mutilations on that body. This is not a quick 15 minutes in the dark.
Now he can indulge in that relationship with the body, that awful kind of horrific mutilation and engagement with the body that wasn't previously available in any of the other murders.
On the morning of the 9th of November, 1888, Thomas Bowyer went to Miller's Court to collect the rent. When he received no answer, he peered through the window. He later told the press that what he'd seen was the work of the devil.
The face is gashed beyond all recognition. The right thigh has been denuded to the bone, including the exterior organs of generation and the right buttock.
What Jack did to her were perhaps some of the most violent acts that it's possible to inflict on a human body.
He's removing various parts of the body. He's putting organs in different positions around what remains of the body itself. And he's almost displaying her for anybody who then comes in and sees her afterwards.
Although the Kelly case is the sort of ultimate satisfaction probably for that offender, there is no sense in which it's going to stop there. There will be a desire to repeat it.
The widely accepted story of Jack the Ripper is that there were 5 victims. Nye has added another, Martha Tabram, at the start of Jack's Autumn of Terror. And now he adds a last, 7th victim.
Everyone assumes that Mary Kelly is the last victim of Jack the Ripper because there appear to be no more murders on that scale again. Serial killers don't just stop killing, they don't just give up and do something else. Mary Kelly was not the last one.
Clay Pipe Alice Mackenzie was seen to be more or less drunk at 8:30 and spotted walking quickly off to Whitechapel towards midnight. Within an hour, she was dead. At her inquest, the verdict was all too familiar. Willful murder by some person or persons unknown. But Mai has evidence to link this last murder to the mortuary attendant. Clay Pipe Alice Mackenzie was murdered in July 1889, and like earlier victims, was killed and mutilated in the street.
This is Castle Alley, and I believe that this is where our story ends. I believe Robert Mann would have taken his last victim, Clay Pipe Alice Mackenzie, along this alleyway. And here is where he killed her. But we're talking about a shadow of his former self.
Her throat was cut, but not to the spine as before. And far from being disemboweled, Alice Mackenzie had surface wounds.
The interesting thing is the location of the wounds. I mean, clearly, again, we've got the homicidal cut throat, and we've got interest in abdominal wounding, clearly, by whoever inflicted these wounds on Clay Pipe Alice. But it does raise the question as to why Clay Pipe Alice's wounds, although interesting in terms of location, are so superficial.
Mai has tracked down Robert Mann's entry in the Whitechapel Register of Deaths. It says he died on the 2nd of January, 1896. Cause of death, phthisis. Today, a doctor would write tuberculosis.
He manages some cuts, nothing like what he used to be capable of, but that's it. He can't do any more. His lungs won't let him.
When the disease flares up, they would have been coughing up blood, but it can affect the central nervous system, it can affect the bones and joints, it can affect the skin. It clearly can be a very debilitating illness, which in many cases will be fatal.
The tuberculosis would take 6 years to kill him, but Mai believes Robert Mann's reign of terror was over. The feeble mutilations to Alice Mackenzie must have felt like failure to him, but for one final victory. Her body, like the first 3 victims, was returned to Robert Mann in his Whitechapel mortuary.
The plan has, after all, come together. That final killing does end up on the slab in front of the man who put that victim there.
Robert Mann fits many aspects of the present-day psychological and geographical profiles. The mortuary gave him specialist anatomical knowledge and the perfect hiding place, in plain sight of the investigating police. He was fortunate that forensic science was in its infancy. Fingerprinting was imminent, but blood typing was 25 years away, and DNA analysis, science fantasy.
The difficulty is that the police were almost operating in the last years where crime scene investigation was not aided by the scientific discoveries that were to happen in the decade or two after these murders.
Modern techniques like geographic profiling give police a toolbox of new strategies to catch a suspect like Jack.
Now, it could be that we set up a decoy operation where we have a woman police officer who fits the profile to the victims to trap someone like Jack the Ripper. There were a couple of pubs, and so you could, for example, set up a test where the pint glasses that are being used in the pub could be tested for DNA.
Even today, it's notoriously difficult to catch a classic serial killer, an individual working alone who murders strangers. No amount of detective work can guarantee identifying the culprit, not by us now, and not by the police in Victorian Whitechapel.
It was just bad luck and circumstance that they didn't happen to get a better sighting, or they didn't nab him in the act.
What we gain by looking at Robert Mann as a potential Jack is to look at the serial killer mindset and the reality of how they work. Robert Mann was a real person, and he fits an established serial killer pattern.
Most of his life he had spent in that workhouse, Mr. Nobody. Only in the autumn of terror he became the most famous serial killer the world has ever known. He became Jack the Ripper.